Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Welcome, good morning. It's really great to have a lot of people tuning in online to this Dean Series event, taking a seat at the board table, perspectives on governance in Aotearoa, New Zealand. And so welcome, I'm the Acting Pro-Vice-Chancellor and Dean of the Wellington School of Business and Government, Jane Bryson. And it's my real pleasure to have this absolutely fabulous panel of speakers here today, and to have Kirsten Patterson, KP, the Chief Executive of the Institute of Directors, as the facilitator of today's conversation. We're not going to read through everyone's bios. Those are available to you online, because we know that you're keen to hear what our panellists have to say. But I would want to reiterate the welcome to the Wellington School of Business and Government, to Te Herenga Waka, Victoria University of Wellington. We're based here in the business school, right in the heart of the city, right between business and government. And the panellists that we have here today have experience in governance right across business, public sector, private sector, not-for-profit. And that's really at the heart of what we're doing here in the business school, bringing together those different perspectives. So I'm really looking forward to hearing what people have to say. And so with no more ado, I'll pass over to KP to referee this session. I'll just mention that you are able to post questions throughout the session, and there is a voting function, so you can vote up the questions that you most want to see answered by the panel, and I'm sure KP will remind you of that as we go through. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jane. Jane may not know this, but actually she's responsible for me getting into my first ever governance role. And it was an advisory board here at the university many years ago, and that was my very first exposure into governance, and here we are today having a conversation about perspectives on governance. So as Jane said, kia ora, my name is Kirsten, but everyone calls me KP. It's my great honour to be the CEO for the Institute of Directors and to be sitting with this amazing panel. The reason we're not reading bios today is because if we were going to read the phenomenal bios of everyone sitting on this panel, there would be your entire hour session, because they've achieved so much, they're doing so many amazing things, and we've really got some sort of great questions and things to dive into. So I'm going to dive straight in. There's opportunity for you to ask questions. Please do use that Q&A function. Vote up those questions and the things that you'd like to sort of pose to the panel. Now's your opportunity to sort of challenge this group, ask them some questions about what they're seeing, what they're thinking, what does the future hold for governance in Aotearoa, New Zealand. So kind of a couple of opening questions to get us started. I'm going to head down the panel. We have got a mic here. Hopefully the sound's going to be okay for you. We're going to get a little bit of feedback on that, but hopefully the sound will be coming through okay as we sort of adjust into the new world. I'm headed this way first. You can pass it along if you want to Rachel, seeing as she's right on the end. She was trying not to make eye contact, saying, "Don't come to me first." But, you know, got to swing the ball out to the right first. Look, you've had a real range of different governance perspectives, and in terms of some of the leadership roles you've held as well. What does good governance look like? What's your sort of vision for good governance for Aotearoa, New Zealand?
Morena koutou. Thank you for having me at my own university. Just want to put that in there. Look, good governance to me and a really strong table looks like one that is diverse, both in thought and in experience. I think it's one that's inclusive. I think it's one that is informed, where people are equally informed about the task at hand. I think it's one where the group has all committed to a similar outcome for the organisation. They're all deeply and similarly committed, albeit they might have different perspectives on how to get to that end point. But I think the strongest tables I have sat at have had a chair that leaves a lot of space for different personalities to show themselves, but also calls out all of those different personalities at the right time. So all of those sorts of attributes.
Yeah. So you sat on a panel, I think it was earlier in the week, and one of the questions you was asked was about board strategy, overrated, underrated. There was a bit of a split on the panel, so I was just interested. How do you tell good governance from the outside? Yeah. Can you see it from the outside? And the sort of board's role in some of those big strategic pieces, is it visible from the outside?
I don't think, if you mean from the outside of a business, probably not. If you mean even from the outside of the boardroom, probably not. It's a hard one to tell unless you have been in there and been part of the conversations and felt and influenced the dynamic at the table. It's very hard to actually tell what's happening there. But I think the question was, do we overrate or underrate a board's ability to influence strategy and the implementation of that? And it was a 2-to-1. And I'd said sometimes we overrate the board's ability to do that, because in my experience, and this is obviously always very contentious around boards and management, it's management's role to create a strategy but then present to the board. This is the way I've liked to do it as a CEO, for their input and for them to show their experience and lean their weight into the parts of the strategy that they're most knowledgeable about or have most the best skill set for. Then their ability to actually implement that, it becomes harder, because really I think their job is to support management's implementation of that strategy. So yeah, we had a bit of a split one there.
Yeah. That'll be an interesting one to come to Melissa on too, in terms of where that responsibility sits. I wonder, as our time as CEOs, as we move into boards, if our view about where strategy responsibility might change as our role changes. Coming to you, Sally, tell us about your perspectives on governance. Successes, failures. What are we seeing, and what's your view?
Okay, all right. Well, so my main experience from governance has been on the Productivity Commission, which is slightly different in that, we were half-time commissioners. So you're a commissioner for most of the time, and then you become a sort of a board when we have the board meetings, but you're much more involved with the organisation as a commissioner. So it's sort of an unusual blend of that. But then on the other hand, I've also reported to some great boards and great chairs, and I think that for me, it's about that, having that really robust conversations and feeling that you've got the trust around the table and the space to really explore things, rather than some of the worst things is when you see people getting into the nitty gritty of operational things. So for me, I think it's that making sure it's that diverse views certainly is wonderful, and being open to challenge but without feeling any threat in the room.
So the Productivity Commission has done some reports on frontier firms and the importance of good governance.
Yep.
Are boards doing enough to focus on productivity? What do we need to be doing?
I actually left the Commission a couple of years ago, so I wasn't involved in that latest one. But I think the productivity issue is not so much that we've got, obviously really good frontier firms. There are some really good frontier firms, almost at world frontier, but it's the long tail. So you've got a huge spread of governance ability and management ability, and we don't have the robust sort of market forces that might actually weed out some of the lower productivity firms in a normal market, because there isn't that pressure there. But certainly I think there's a lot of things about skill level in board and management that I think is still, says us sitting in a business school, that are still could be greatly improved. And I think some of that is about sharing, being more sharing around with experience, and that's where I think the IOD plays an important role of upskilling people.
Great, thank you. Suzanne, I'm going to come across to you. So passing the baton, literally, across to you. What does good governance look like?
Well, I came up with a little acronym, which is Aroa Nui, lots of love, where L stands for love. I think there needs to be a lot more love, and that is reflected in diversity. But it also needs to be reflected a lot more than I've seen in terms of understanding your customer, understanding your stakeholders and your shareholders, understanding your staff, and actually recognizing that they've all got a role to play. And with that, you also then can recognize opportunity. I feel that we put so much time into compliance that a lot of low-hanging fruit is missed in New Zealand, where we could actually be stretching a lot more than we do. And risk management strategies which focus only on risk and not on the mitigations which can lead to opportunities really have undermined, I think, the effectiveness of what boards could be. And then with teamwork, you can achieve so much more, because you've actually started to value every single essence of your organization, which I think would ultimately contribute to higher productivity. I know people work long hours in New Zealand, Where do we get more out of those long hours? Well, I think changing the whole spectrum from thinking about risk all the time and compliance and detail to thinking about where is that stretch target we could go for, and then who would be doing what to get there, and reinforcing accountabilities along the way. And then related to that is time. The biggest limitation is time. We all think of money as being it, but the reality is that if you start off with a strategy which has got a 3-year term, and by the end you still haven't achieved most of it, you've lost real time. And quite frequently the reason why people haven't achieved their strategies is because they've spent so much time on the detail and the risk at the beginning, rather than thinking about what are the steps we should be taking to get to that strategy. And then that's lots, and so the last thing is strategy. Boards really need to change the time allocation on the agenda for strategy to be at the priority.
Have you seen boards who are doing that really well, or is this something that we generally have to lift the floor on?
We have to lift the floor on.
Yeah.
The best I've seen is what we were trying to do with Transparency International, because what we did there is we not only had board members, but we have members with delegated authority. So every time something came up that provided us a stretch target, instead of expecting the board to do more, we thought about who could do that job well for us, and we'd find somebody to appoint to do that role. And so I think starting from an organization with 32 members, I think the profile has grown quite dramatically, and there's recognition of what transparency means to New Zealand as a result. But if we'd started and done everything incrementally in the normal ways that boards I've been on work, we would still have, maybe if we're lucky, a few members and a once-a-year AGM. And that really is ridiculous, because the opportunity for New Zealand, given its public sector with very low corruption, and by the way, I think that's an important attribute about the business school here in Wellington, that it is in the city where there's such low corruption. Why wouldn't you think of a way to actually harvest the benefits of that? And so that's what we did, and that's what's still being done under the new leadership of Anne Tolley and Julie Haggie.
Yeah, more boards need to be discussing transparency and ethics issues, that's for sure. So I want to come back to this point about stakeholder shareholder as well in a moment. So I'll come back to that after we've spoken with Melissa. I'm also interested in Melissa's view about, can you set a 3-year strategy anymore? Or are we talking 3 minutes? Because the world's changing so fast.
Yeah. Look, I wish I'd said most of what Suzanne was saying there, because I do think that, for me, I think governance is situational, and I think trying to kind of go, oh, this is what it's like for every situation, and this is what good governance looks like in every situation, is pointless, right? So, I designed and lead those strategy courses for the IOD, and one of the big things I think we get across is it's very different working perhaps in a family-owned business, very different again if you've got shareholders in the business. I was on the board of Jasmix, we had 29 shareholders in the business. You run a business like that, and governance is very different, stakeholder management is very different when you've got a lot of, 10% of the staff own you. It's very different. And then we took it to a point where we opened share ownership up to all of the staff, and so it changes the dynamic. And the same if it's an iwi organisation, you basically got maybe 1,000 people who all tell you what they think, or and then public sector governance, again, quite different. And I think we shouldn't fall into this, it's got to be this way. So thinking about, does the board own strategy or does the CEO own strategy? I think it's really different depending on the size of the organisation, the competence. If you've got a really weak board, the last thing you want is that board driving strategy, right? But equally, if you've perhaps got a weak executive, then the board kind of needs to step over a little and get up and under them and kind of affy them into what does good strategy look like. So I think we've got to be a bit careful about sort of going, it lands this way or that way. And then the last thing I want to say is that I played cricket, and I remember running into John Wright in an airport one day, and we were talking about teamwork. And he looked at me like I was a moron, and he said to me, cricket's just not a team sport. He said, what it is that you get all these specialists and they go out there and they play their position. So, you're like the really good at silly madon, or you're really good at bowling, but you go out and you just do your thing. And I've thought about that a lot as metaphors for the boards I haven't enjoyed. And the boards I haven't enjoyed, you've got the chair kind of directing traffic and sending you're the lawyer, we'll now ask you that question, or you're the accountant, you'll now deal with that one. And people sort of like pop up like whack-a-mole on their specific thing. Yep. Whereas the ones I love being on are what I call learning boards, where you're all trying to, you determine the North Star, and then you work with the executive to keep that North Star held, and then you're learning all the time. But I think those kinds of boards are still emergent in New Zealand. We've still got a lot more of the pop-up when it's my turn boards, and I hope it's a generational thing, that as this new sort of generation, and it's weird where the 50-year-olds are the young people, right? But where that new generation coming through are starting to change that dynamic. Yeah. That's my 10 cents worth.
So there's hardly any rules in actual legislation or regulation about how we do our governance, right?
Yeah.
But somehow we all do it the same way. So, pretty much most people could go, oh yes, I expect to see on the agenda there's going to be some minutes, there's going to be action items, there's going to be a few of these things, and we kind of fall into this kind of model, and board papers will come out like this and we'll meet in that kind of way. Is that the future of governance? You talked about kind of stepping over this line. Is the line between governance and management going to be a lot more grey and porous now? What's governance going to look like? What should it look like for the future?
Yeah, I guess there's kind of two things to unpack there. One is that, when I first joined the Institute, you weren't allowed to be on advisory boards. And it was a black mark against you. You were either a director or you weren't. And so these lines have been moving for 20 years to be, they're not new. But the other one is that I don't believe that we are all doing it the same. I think you'll find that in family-owned businesses, there's probably a lot more rough and tumble around the table than there are at many of corporate boards. Which is, I like being in private businesses. I've realised private for-purpose businesses or community-owned for-purpose businesses is my sweet spot. And I think if you're very for-purpose driven, our board papers tend to be designed around our impact, and we might get to some of that compliance stuff at the end of the meeting, rather than perhaps the old-fashioned ones where you spend the first hour and a half completely mind-numbing, going through the minutes and all that stuff. So I think those changes are already out there. I don't know what your experience is.
Yeah, I agree. I think boards are trying to find ways to manage strategy better, and everybody's testing different things. I don't think anyone's come up with the right thing quite yet. One of the challenges always is that you get onto a track with a strategy and then some sort of crisis arises, and all of a sudden the whole board meeting is turned over to that crisis rather than the strategy, and the strategy always gets treated as something to get to when you had time, a kind of luxury rather than the real thing. So even the boards that I've been on where strategy is the main purpose, they still can't keep it there in the forefront for long enough in my experience. So that we're still very much experimenting, I think. But I agree with Melissa that while, yes, maybe in general the formats are more or less the same, there are lots of experiments happening about how to use that format differently. One of the interesting things I find, though, is that when you get a new director, they immediately want to bring you back to the formalities.
Really?
Yeah, I've found that, and it's fascinating. So we're talking about the idea of youth being wise and perhaps more team-focused, but I haven't found that. I've found, in fact, that it doesn't matter pretty much who you bring on, that the sense of responsibility about being a board member means that they think they need some sort of framework in order to be a board member. Yeah. Whereas what I'm trying to engender in my boards is along the lines Melissa was just talking about, which is we're there for a purpose and we're there as a team, and let's share our ideas openly and transparently about what we want to do, but let's make those ideas strategic and purposeful.
Yeah. It's probably not a surprise. That would be the experience we hear, particularly from executive teams as well. Those new directors, often the ones who sort of go, have I had a bad experience with the board? It's my turn to hold management to account. So we get a little bit of that coming through, but also I guess maybe this kind of needing a structure, that kind of view. And I think that's one of the things that we want to unpick. What do we have to follow that structure? Does good practice just basically mean average practice? Is there a unique New Zealand governance opportunity here that we should be creating?
I was going to say that I think what board papers say and what actually happens in a board meeting are two quite different things. And actually, a lot of the boards that I'm now reporting to, it's mostly take it as read, and unless there's something that comes up. So we tend to pick on just a couple of things that we really want to get into, and very much with the National Science Challenge, for example, very much about what can we do to really move this along and what have you. I mean, I think Rachel should probably say about talk about the future of board, because my experience of working with the Federation of Māori Authorities and going to some of their conferences was the first time I think I saw a 1,000-year cash flow projection. I think we have a lot to learn from Te Ao Māori.
Thank you. It's interesting, I was just want to go back really quickly to the comment about people, the whack-a-mole. Because interestingly, one of the boards that I sit on, who has an incredible chair, said to me straight out of the gates, we do not have a finance person, we do not have an audit person, we do not have a marketing person. Essentially, you better be ready to be all of those people, because that's my expectation. And she said, nothing irritates me more than people expecting that they can skim the financials, because it's not really their game. So I love that. That's a really amazing sign of, I think, a great board is when everyone can contribute equally. Look, I think that I always sort of rally against universality in any forum, and so I don't think there is a New Zealand way of necessarily doing anything, let alone at the board table. I think that there, like Melissa alluded to, there are horses for courses, and there will be, much as there is a way that a company will do business, I think the board has to be representative of that business in the way that they conduct themselves. And so yes, in our business within Kono, Māori organisation, family owned, everyone at that table is related. We do start from a place of very high trust and love, and also a very collective way of moving and thinking, albeit it never transforms into groupthink, because it's a dangerous place to play, but certainly there is a collective way of moving that leads you in great and beautiful and often challenging places. And it made me laugh when I read the Netflix case study that went around a couple of years ago about how interesting it was that the Netflix board were getting down and dirty and seeing what was happening in the business. I'm like, you come to our business. The board know almost more than any of us put together. It's just phenomenal, and they do that. One, it was a legislative activity that was put in place when Māori authorities were established. That it was a committee of management at the outset, and I think still may be. But so they had to conduct themselves in a way that was different to a standard board. But also, as you are thrust into commerce, you pick up off the shelf models of behaviour and models of being that are, number one, Western in orientation and very formulaic and very orthodox. And you pick them up because seemingly they work and you apply them to your business. But I think as more businesses become stronger and as boards become stronger in their own capabilities, they start to fine-tune those practices in a way that's more authentic to them, that makes them much better versions of themselves. So, I think even I would see that not only in a Māori organisation, but in one of the bigger boards I'm on for a publicly listed company, there's a way to be human about some of the very formal and required procedures that you need to undertake, and that's the skill of a chair.
I think that's a great insight, isn't it? Because isn't that why we have boards in the first place? Because if there was a formula to it, then management could apply it, right? So that's by definition, no one CEO can have all the answers. Otherwise, we wouldn't need a board. That's why we need diversity, and we need a group around the table to do that. I'm interested in this piece about purpose. So IOD is part of a global network of directors institutes, and our Brazilian colleagues have got their conference coming up, and they've invited us to attend online. It's got this amazing theme. If purpose is the starting point, governance is the path. I'm interested in how important, what's the role of purpose in governance? Melissa's raised it. That's where she called it her sweet spot. Those are the things she's interested in. We released a paper at the IOD recently, stakeholders, shareholders, and we got absolutely savaged by both ends. You know, so in the last 2 weeks, I've been called everything from the Vampires Collective through to being a dandelion, being too soft. So, you know, it's kicked off this huge debate. Where does purpose and where do stakeholders fit in this purpose?
It probably goes back to Suzanne's comment about love. And I was in a meeting this week and I was talking about, you know, what makes a good board, what's a good chair. And I think I used the word love about 10 times. And in retrospect, it's like, was that too much for them? I don't know. It's like it is something I genuinely feel. And I think that if you don't love the organisation that you are representative of or that you are there to support, and if you don't love the industry that you have chosen to spend your time in, it's going to show itself fairly quickly. And part of that is having a strong and clear and agreed purpose about why you even exist and why you are at that table, because it's a privilege to be at the board table and it's a responsibility. So if you don't genuinely throw all of yourself into its reason for being, it will be a very hard road, and I think you'll only do a percentage of the job that is actually expected or required of you as a director. So we don't call our shareholders, we call them owners, very deliberately, because they are our owners. They own us as an organisation, and many of them are within the business, and that's amazing, having owner-operators in your business. They are the best ambassadors. They always are thinking a little bit more than everyone about how they can do a better job, what could be improved. For the most part, it's what could we do better, which is good and a good challenge. But yeah, we call them owners because that's what they are to us. Oh, and whānau.
Sally, views on purpose?
Yes, well, I think because most of the boards that I've been involved with have been public sector, so the purpose is always
very clear,
quite a lot broader, and it's very much, particularly with the ones I'm dealing with at the moment, it's very much about impact. What's our impact? We're also the National Science Challenge is a temporary organisation, so it's also what's our legacy, and I think we keep coming back to that all the time in terms of, and it's not about commercialisation and economic impact, it's about behavioural change, it's about capability building, it's about those things that actually are harder to measure but probably will have a longer term impact on our ability to do, you know, in our case, you know, innovate in the physical sciences and engineering. So, you know, and I think the Productivity Commission was the same. It wasn't about, you know, productivity per se, it was about the performance of the New Zealand economy for everybody's well-being. And so it's a much bigger, I mean, actually I think productivity is a word that is badly used, because I think it's actually a word that most businesses don't actually even think about, particularly unless they're manufacturing. It's much more about performance and profitability for the whānau. So the boards I've been involved in, that's always been quite central. We still have to tick the boxes for making sure you're prudent and transparent and what have you, but it's very much about what can we do to improve our impact in a variety of ways.
Suzanne, your purpose led by definition, the work you do, the approach you take. Where does purpose fit with governance and organisational purpose?
Well, one of the things about love, and I was thinking about this when I was putting the word down on the paper as to whether I should say that today. So I share your perspective on that, is that you've got to be careful, because for some people it does make you look like a dandelion. But I decided I would stick with it, because what I think good directors do is they think about the board they're on all the time.
Yeah.
And I don't think there's enough respect for the fact that that's how good directors behave. Mm-hmm. I think quite often the CEO sees that as interfering rather than supportive. And I'd like to think we can change that perspective. And sometimes I know that there are board members who are interfering and who don't think before they jump, and who don't seem to lack a sort of kinesthetic awareness of their impact on others. And I think that's something which you're working through with different courses and training at the IOD, and I highly regard those courses and why you're doing it. And we need to be aware that there are people like that. But in general, the people I've worked with really want to be aware all the time of the purpose of the board. And when they see something happening where they think they could make a difference, prevent it from going the wrong direction or whatever, they want to be taken seriously at that point. And when you have a purposeful board, you've got a channel for that energy to be used productively so that people don't get angry and crisis-driven and stressed. They can instead see that the energy they've put into thinking about things in between meetings is actually being generated into change for the better for the board.
Yeah, a conversation I have with my CEO colleagues, you can tell great board members who are thinking about us between board meetings. Right? We know those who are reading their papers and coming to meetings, and we know those who are genuinely thinking about us in between. What does this mean for the IOD? What does this mean for the business that I'm in? And when they're seeing things, curating things, reading other things about that kind of context. So I think that's indication of that they're purpose-led and committed to the purpose of the organisation. Melissa, this is your sweet spot. What's the
I just think
role for
often
purpose?
Boards don't spend enough time revisiting purpose and thinking about purpose, or they take it for granted. And so I think about, I'm on the board of a meat company, and I don't know if you, the meat industry is what doesn't look like this. I am part of Meat Women, which is hilarious, which is a global, there's still only about 1,000 of us, that are in senior roles globally in the meat industry, right? But what I love is I've joined an all-male board that are owners of the business. And before I got there, they defined their purpose as for the love of ethically farmed lamb. And so we talk about love every board meeting, which I really like. And we use that as our, the North Star, right? So we stop and we go, well, so this last one, board meeting, we're going to have a really deep dive, say, into regenerative agriculture through the lens of love. Or we, very early on, we implemented, what's now called social distancing, but we implemented that in our meat plants before anybody else, right? Or in the US, we discovered that our employees there are the only meat packers in the US that get health insurance. Right? So, so we take that love and we think then, what does that mean? What does it mean to love our staff? What does it mean to love our animals that, and we kill them, right? So we have discussions about what is it to kill something. We're like, and I just think that's the work of the board. And that's where you can pack around executives, because the executives often don't have the time to stop and do that, especially, with what they've had to deal with in this last year with massive disruption and so on. So I think that's part of that work of the board, is often they don't stop and do purpose. And I wanted to pick up on what Suzanne said about strategy and crisis, because I was deputy chair of Radio New Zealand as we went into the pandemic, and we had a brand new chair, and it was fascinating because you could see him wanting to go off and come up with a crisis plan. And I said to him, hey, we've got a strategy. This is the moment you just double down on your strategy. Your strategy tells you what your theory is of how to succeed here. So we just double down. And I remember him looking at me with this big grin. And then, I've now rotated off the board. And recently we had another conversation. And he said, the freedom that gave of not having to now invent some crisis plan, because actually we had a really good strategy. And the strategy should work in all circumstances, do you know? So the strategy should be the thing you go back to when you're busy, should be the thing you go back to when you're in trouble, and so on. But I see, I'm just going to say this, so my first degree is actually from here too, in anthropology. And I feel like as an anthropologist, I look at New Zealanders and we like DIY and we like action. And so we throw the strategy out because we forget about it, because we just want to do shit. You know? And I think that's where we shoot ourselves in the foot. And I think if we come back and go, oh, hang on, what's our purpose? And then the strategy to me is what's our theory of change? How do we think that purpose will be achieved? That's what the strategy is. But often what I see in New Zealand organisations, it's not that. It's here's our to-do list. And so, in the courses we teach, we're really clear that strategy and strategic planning are on different universes. But I think most New Zealand organisations just like a plan, as opposed to stopping and thinking and going, well, what's our theory of how this business wins?
So you said it last year, the pandemic felt like 2 years already, maybe felt like 10, the dog years, right? Do you think, have we learned something? Are there some silver linings out of being disrupted over the last 18 months, 2 years? Are we taking those lessons forward, or are we still wanting to fix stuff with a operational plan?
I look, it's going to be different for different businesses. Coming back to Rachel's horses for courses word, it is. It's going to be different for different companies. I'm going to say something that's not going to be very popular, but some of the problem that we have is that when we put too many subsidies in, I think we save jobs, but we also create zombie companies. So in a normal era, companies would have failed in this last couple of years. And I do think it's been in the public interest to keep jobs. However, I think we're going to see, as in the next year or so, we're going to see a number of companies go broke that probably just should have.
Yeah.
And
we've become intolerant of failure, though, haven't we? We've become intolerant of companies failing and generally.
No one likes failure. I don't think that's a new thing. I don't think anyone likes failure, no matter how they can go on about, I've come out of startup and they can go on and on about fast fail. Only people who haven't failed think fast fail's a good thing. Do you know what I mean? Nobody, no one wants to fail.
Yeah. Always, it hurts, right?
Yeah.
It hurts. Yeah. It hurts. Yeah. Stakeholders, shareholders.
Well, I thought about this because it was one of your questions that you gave us in advance, and as an economist, one of the things I have a big belief in, and I don't believe in the market solving all our problems, but I do believe there is a market out there which has its own independent momentum, and part of the market is your partners. So as a company or an organization, you know about your directors, you know about your staff, and you might have a definition of who your customers are. But I find very few people actually think about who are their other partners, their suppliers, their distributors, who in the media pays attention to you. And so you actually have a lot of stakeholders, I think. And generally speaking, they're not as visible as they could be when you're thinking about your strategy. So I think stakeholders need to be given a big tick along with shareholders. So you need to love your shareholders, but you also need to define and identify, love, and maybe care for a bit more your stakeholders.
Yeah. Rachel, you talked about owners, talked about whānau, stakeholders, shareholders. There's a lot of pressure sort of going on. Directors are responsible for everything. Everything's a governance issue if you think about it deeply enough, right? So you're only 5 questions away from going, that's a governance question. What's the board's role in playing outside making profit?
It's actually, I think as Susan said, you're thinking about it all the time. So I think my expectation of my fellow directors or my board, if I'm sitting in a management position, is that they are your number one advocates. And that if they see an opportunity that can progress the position of the business or the performance of the business, that they're taking that on board and feeding that through in an appropriate manner. So I think that you need to love your owners as much as you do your stakeholders and recognise your place as against them. But it also has to be mutually beneficial. It's not just a drag on your stakeholders. I think you have to add value to their space as well, and that's how you get the most meaningful relationships, generally speaking, but with regards to your stakeholders specifically.
So beyond that, to sort of the duties of the board, climate change, transparency in your supply chain, you've in some of the listed environments you're in, you've got some, if you tried to do a stakeholder map, that's the planet.
It's pretty weighty.
It's the planet.
Yeah.
So how do you balance all of that up?
I think carefully, and it's a bit of a divide and conquer. And within the warehouse, we've got an S. Well, ordinarily we'd be called ESG, but we've dropped the G because we actually think it's everyone. It's not just the governance scenario, so it's ESS. And I chair that subcommittee. And it, in our first meeting, we spent an hour in what I would call whakawhanaungatanga. People getting to know each other. I really wanted to tease out why people opted into ESS. What was it about that attracted them? Because there's lots of things you can do with, unless you're actually required to be there as part of the team, to do with your time. And just some really amazing human stories showed themselves, which is my point about no matter how big the board and how big the company and the regulations by which you might need to adhere, we still are people, and there are reasons that we do things, and there are motivations which make us better at what we do. And so that conversation got into people's upbringings and their exposure to poverty or their positions on inequity or pollution, where they grew up in cities and watched those very cities kind of consume themselves, which is a long way of saying I think that the board has to be wholly invested in every element of the business, but recognise where it's better that they take pole position or they get in and under, as Melissa said, and support management and their ability to advance any part of the cause.
Yeah. Sally, any comments on?
Yeah, the stakeholder things, again, with the public sector organisations, everybody is your stakeholder, as people were saying, but I think also, the Productivity Commission is not actually a really big organisation, neither is the National Science Challenge. We can't actually achieve what we want to achieve by ourselves. So you're really part of an ecosystem. So it's actually, trying to be as collaborative as possible and supportive, I think, rather than seeing everybody in the system as a competitor, I think has been quite key to actually thinking a bit more about that line of sight to impact is not straight from our organisation. It's going to have to be a collective effort. And so I've been really enjoying that side of things, actually getting over this New Zealand intense interest in being competitive as opposed to thinking about from a more New Zealand Inc. point of view, and particularly in the public sector.
Yeah, it's probably some lessons a few of us in the not-for-profit sector need to learn instead of starting our own little individual charities. Easiest place in the world to start a charity. We're very generous Kiwi folk with our time and with our money, but a little more collaboration, not necessarily a straight line from our own organisation. We might achieve the purpose a little bit more, but that's my soapbox for another day. A few questions coming through, so thank you for that. Question here, what are some of the diversity metrics, gender, ethnicity overall across New Zealand boards? Do we have in New Zealand studies on improvements in business performance with more diverse governance? It's an all-female panel. Do we have a view on diversity and the benefits of that in terms of improvement on business performance? I would count this as one of my whack-a-mole questions. This is one I get often. Is diversity good for business? Whack, whack, whack. The answer is yes. Does anyone have a longer answer than just yes?
Well, the board I'm reporting to at the moment is only got 4 members at the moment. We're short one, but it's 50-50 Māori and tangata tiriti, and 75% female, and we're having great fun. So,
so it's still yes.
Yeah.
No, none others. I mean, I think that one of the things I love having around the table are young people, and whether they're future directors and senior execs in their own businesses, but young to the world of governance, or they are genuinely young. And my perspective on that changes year on year. Still, what represents young? But, having those really interesting voices at the table, but also making sure it's a very safe environment for them to give their perspective, because it can be, I think sometimes when new directors come in and they do try to bring you back to the rules, it's because I think they're scared. That's a pretty intimidating environment in which to find yourself, and you've read the 4 pillars and you're all ready, and and if they don't do it in the order in which you've read it, there's a moment of shock because you're not quite sure what comes next. But having young, interesting voices at the table, you've just got to have them there. It makes you better as a more experienced director to have them there.
Yeah. Aside, any comments on diversity metrics? In the New Zealand context, it's very difficult. We've only really got publicly available information for NZX and for state sector, which is why a lot of the information goes there. State sectors hit 50%. They hit a target. They set a clear target and they were able to achieve that in terms of gender. They've only just started measuring ethnicity. And so, we'll start to see a little bit more of that in state sector, but we don't even have that information across most of our boards, right? Because, Suzanne, any
I think the fact that
perspectives on
you've
that?
got that information, it'll be good to see that out there a bit more from the Institute. I'm a big believer in diversity, and I'm also, I think we need both targets and quotas if we're going to get there. As Rachel said, when you've got the experience of diversity, you know how well it works and what has been missing when it wasn't there. But those boards that don't have it, I think of them a little bit like a Rubik cube. You probably won't find any board these days where somebody doesn't say they want diversity, but there sure are a lot of boards out there that don't have it to this day. And I think it's because when everyone looks alike, when they come to think of the next new board member, they tend to choose someone that looks like them. And if they don't actually move aside and make a space for that new person to come in, then the space never arises. And I've just been waiting for so many years now. And, one of your questions was, what is board going to look like in 50 years? And I realize I've been on boards now for nearly 40, and a lot of things haven't changed in those 40 years. So I think particularly with diversity, because it is so important and such a powerful thing, we need to think much more seriously about both targets and quotas.
Yeah, there's some feedback on that question. It'd be interesting to get your views on, Melissa, that the evidence is mixed on business performance in regards to diversity. I'm not sure I'd necessarily agree with that comment. There's some measures about, does it impact on share price? But is that the measure? Is that the measure of success? But how do you integrate, how do you get the benefits of that diversity?
I guess I don't think New Zealand's done this research, but there's a mountain of international research, and it's not mixed. The mountain of international research shows that the more women that you put on the board, the better the financial performance of the organisation.
Strategy.
They've shown that, I taught the digital transformation course for IOD, and one of the case studies we do is we look at Disney's board, and Disney went out very, very specifically and designed the most diverse board they could get. And so they did that based on ethnicity, based on age, based on gender, and based on sexual orientation. And they've been one of the highest performing consistently boards in the US. They took a $10 billion hit last year in revenue, and it made almost no difference to the business, because since they recruited this board, the growth has been so phenomenal. And I think, and there are case studies from the Nordic countries where they put in quotas and shown productivity and profitability massively increase, and there's no other correlation. So I agree. I think New Zealand, we are only going to have to do it. We're going to have to put in quotas, and it's not something I would have said 10 years ago, but I think we have to do that. But the other thing that I would say is that as a board member, it's picking up on what you said, as a board member, you've got a huge responsibility. So pretty much every board I've been on for the last 20 years, because it started with family planning 20 years ago, I have, over time, helped to create associate roles where we bring in young people who would not normally get a place, or we bring in people for career development in order to do that. And, and you see that it works. And Beef and Lamb did a great job of bringing mostly women into those roles and then pushing them out. And we're thinking about how we build a whole sector, not just a pipeline for ourselves, but say for the rural sector, how do we build that pipeline? And so when I came off the Beef and Lamb board, I was their first independent. I pushed really hard to be replaced by someone who was tangata whenua, because they don't get elected. And, you have to and then the same when I came off a government board, I did actually have a terrible time as the only woman on that board, and I had a chair who really was the most sexist sort of arsehole I probably ever worked with, to be fair. And when I know, and the minister said to me, well, do you want to start, do you want to come back? And I'm like, no. I said, but you have to put 2 women on this board. You can't just have one be the sacrificial lamb. And bless them, the next chair is a woman, and there are more women on that board. And I think we also have to call it out. I think often as women we just suck it up. And there's a couple of things there. There's who are we putting a hand down and pulling up? And how are we thinking about that beyond just gender, but also what ethnicities we're pulling up, what sexual orientations we're pulling up, whatever it is. So how do we do that? How do we build that into the culture of the board? And I talked about learning boards. Learning boards think about, okay, who don't we have here? Can we co-opt them somehow? Can we bring them in another way? And I think that's becoming more and more acceptable.
Can I just make a really quick comment about the quota? I think as somebody who, would obviously be a recipient, Māori, woman, commercial, you're going to fit into some kind of, if it is a quota scenario. And it happens. There are occasions when you're invited to do things, when you're invited quite obviously because you're a Māori woman. And increasingly, the Māori women at the end of those invitations are saying, no, thank you. Because there are ways and ways to to extend those invitations. And if it is obviously so someone can tick their box of diversity, that's not a great way to enter a situation. It doesn't feel great to be the recipient of that invitation. So I think that we have to think really, really carefully about how we go about extending or forcing the hand of boards to be better and think more smartly about diversity and inclusion. And it can't be, we've got, you're right,
Noah's Ark.
Yeah, a couple of those,
Yeah.
great, we're away. It has to be better. We are better than that as an economy and as business people and as governors and directors. We are much better, we're much smarter than that. And you can see them coming a mile away when they are genuine in their intent to want to be better, and they know that you have something that isn't at that table already, as against necessarily just filling a seat. So I just think as we go through that process and being better, then we can be better.
Yeah, so how do we encourage new faces, new thought?
She's passing it back.
Yeah.
Actually, I've been thinking about
It's
this
not
too.
like science on boards. We did a piece with the Royal Society about trying to get science back into boardrooms. Climate change. Hello, we need science in the boardroom.
Yeah.
So that's an aspect of diversity. How do we get new faces, new thoughts into boardrooms?
Well, that's one of the reasons that I first went on the IOD course probably 30 years ago.
Mumble years ago.
Because there was a push then to try and get more scientists on the board. But then it's a bit more than just the science, though. I think it's actually making sure you've got people there who can really critique and question. And it doesn't necessarily have to be a scientist, although I think there's a lot of value in science and engineering, particularly on boards. So I think that's the role that's important. That it's more being evidence-based, I think, rather than just and I think the critic about we put a rangatahi person on our board, and she's picked us up on some things that you just take for granted. You take, as you've been at people places for a while, she's said, well, why do we have to do it this way? Why can't we do it that way? And it's been really, really good. So I agree with that from a point of view of getting that sort of it's that getting out of what you do end up getting a bit of groupthink. It's making sure that you've got enough diversity in there, and those sort of people who will go out and do some research on it and think, look, this is really interesting, and circulate that sort of stuff to the board. Maybe.
And I think not very old, gosh, I hope people don't think I'm talking about them specifically, but we have kaumātua on our board, and there's very, very young and then there's very, very old, and I think that the contributions that they make are profound. They're very still and very quiet for the most part of the meeting, but when they speak, it's sort of the ultimate mic drop moment, because if you're anywhere near off course, you are immediately snapped back into, the purpose. Yeah. Like if you need a wayfinder, get you a kaumātua on your board.
Yeah. Got a question here about politics on a board. How do you understand the politics of governance and being in a successful, Rachel? You just said you had a very political kind of environment. How do you manage your way through multiple stakeholders and some of those pressures?
I just think you have to be really really honest about what your position is, and I think that you also can't have any ego. If you have an ego, generally it makes life hard, but at a board table, it most certainly makes life hard. I think that my experience of my board is that everyone recognises what their responsibility is for this moment in time. And it's not about us, it's about who's coming through in the future generations. So it is our responsibility to make sound, strong decisions now that allow for a prosperous future for our grandchildren's grandchildren and beyond. And that's that purpose and that's that vision about, and that collective agreement about what we're here to do. And we're here to, and I should say, I've just finished with Kono, but I still feel very much a part of the whānau because we're whakapapa te Waka too. But our purpose is to preserve and enhance our taonga, our treasures, be that people or place, for the benefit of present and future generations. We know that, and I could, in my every fibre, I know it, and I know that all of our board do, and our owners and our team. And everyone has a different relationship to that purpose, but it makes the very hard decisions a piece of cake.
Yeah, I love that in terms of the ego and the listening, right? Because By definition, board members need to be able to listen because they don't hold the individual responsibility. So that's absolutely critical that we have directors who can be prepared to change their position on issues, which, if you come in with ego and thinking you're just imparting wisdom, that's hard.
I mean, I've often been the first independent on a board, and a number of those have been membership type organisations. And I think about membership type organisations, I kind of think you get elected what I call a local beauty parade. So often what you end up with is really good people, but they're elected because they're electable. And then you get, say, they cover the country because they're regional reps, and then they've got quite a lot that they have to carry because they carry the national piece, but they've been elected by their locality of some sort, right? So, so that if they go to town in Timaru or something, everybody at the supermarket has a go at them. So there's sort of big P and little p politics going on. And I think that's, again, where using independence can be quite useful and having the right balance, particularly, say, in the primary sector where you get enough voices from outside, because we've got some really big issues we're grappling with in the primary sector, whether it's climate or water or, wage issues, kind of equity. We've got a bunch of stuff around like modern slavery and imports of materials, and there are some really big issues, and those are not always the issues that you get like, someone with a finger at you at the supermarket, right? And so I think having that, having some independence actually helps to take the conversation one step higher sometimes. And then the other bit, which has probably been the lesson that I've had to keep learning, is just to keep looking at my fellow board members with as much generosity as possible. And so when I find that I disagree with them on my whole social theory, I have perhaps, what I mean? Like I come from a different, my family are very liberal. My parents founded at Amnesty International in New Zealand. My dad's a human rights lawyer. Like I come from a particular worldview that is not the same as often the people I find myself in the boardroom with. And I think coming to that with a real generosity and a sense of inquiry, like what is it that makes you think that all government's a waste of time? Or what is it that makes you think that you're a self-made man and everybody else should stand on their own 2 feet? Or like what's underneath that? And I think that inquiry helps to be able to find the bridges and to go, well, you know what, like future generations that you say, all of those people, no matter if I disagree with them about their social theory or what the role of government is or something else, they actually want a better world for their children, for their grandchildren. And so how do we keep coming back to like their higher purpose and connecting there? But I don't think we should underestimate the political impacts, particularly on those organisations that have local elections for something. And it'd be the same if it's, I've never been on a council, like a regional council or a city council or something, but I think it would be the same.
Yeah. Well, 2 degrees of separation in New Zealand, right? We're all connected anyway.
But just that generosity and inquiry.
Excuse me, I'm just going to, before Jane pops up to finish up, I'm going to couple of very quick fire question for you. What can the University Wellington School of Business and Government do to support governance in Aotearoa New Zealand? What would you like? What's the challenge you're laying down?
They can work closely with the Institute of Directors who sets the standards for what governance should be in New Zealand. But I think we need a lot more people being educated in governance all the way through, in a sense, their academic careers. One of the big challenges, I think, with this political challenge that we've been put around the board table is that most people have been educated to be good at something. And so they may be a good scientist or they may be a good technologist. And regrettably, they don't seem to communicate as well as they could with other disciplines. And so just starting with the concept of governance is a cross-disciplinary issue, and how do we incorporate that into all of our academia and training, so by the time they get to you, wanting to be directors, they're actually ready for that broader conversation to take place around purpose at the board table.
Great. Melissa, did you have any challenge? No?
I'm a bit intuitive.
Now's your chance.
You've got to swipe, Kath, that's right. For me, it would be to really broaden the definition of what capable looks like. I think that we get pretty stuck in what an agreed version of capable, and increasingly, I just can't believe that we don't go out of our way, or that we haven't already, to redefine what capable looks like. And in my new role, I'm sitting in an office down on Featherston Street, and it's a consultancy business of about 30 young Māori, te reo native, degrees up their arms, incredible minds. Now, where are they, and how do we lift up those kids, because they are doing phenomenal work, and they're 30 of what I think would be about 3,000, and if we can broaden our definition of what capable looks like, they'll crush it. So I just think we need to just, as we're training people into this space, open their minds to new ideas of capable, and not see it as a comment on their own capabilities. It's just an and. It's an addition to what's capable.
Yeah, get those doors open, those fences. Fantastic, thank you. We could have gone on for another hour. Lots of questions and lots of things coming through, but I've really appreciated your time this morning. Thank you, as we've adapted to this sort of world of distancing, and I'm hand back to Jane.
Thanks, KP, and thank you to all our fabulous panellists this morning, Rachel, Sally, Suzanne and Melissa, and KP's wonderful umpiring of the discussion. I hope you've all enjoyed it as much as I have. I've got a page full of notes, from learning boards to love to whack-a-mole to, just very inspiring, lots of ideas, and a good challenge put out to the Wellington School of Business and Government to make sure we take a cross-disciplinary work across those faculties in the university to get governance in there into all our programs. So thank you for joining us online, and or if you're watching after the event, thank you for watching. We have more interesting conversations in the Dean Series planned, and we hope that with the next one we can actually physically invite you back onto the campus. And if people have other ideas about Dean Series events they'd like to see, please feel free to drop us a line and keep up with us on social media or through the website or email. Thank you very much.